My parents sold my $450,000 vacation home that I spent 12 years buying and building. When I discovered the forged power of attorney, my mother coldly declared, "You've always wasted money on meaningless things. We need that money to secure your brother's future." I couldn't hide my smile because the house they sold was actually, "Thank you for being here with me today. I hope you're having a wonderful day wherever you are." I'd love it if you could share in the comments which city or country you're watching from and what time it is there. Now, let's begin our story together. My name is Ethan, and I'm what you might call the responsible one in my family. At 35, I've built a decent career as an architect. A job that demands precision, patience, and a healthy respect for solid foundations, qualities that seem to be in short supply in my own household growing up. It's funny, isn't it? How we often gravitate towards professions that fill a void, or perhaps reflect a quiet protest against the chaos we've known. My family, bless their hearts, always seemed to prefer the grand gesture, the flashy scheme, over the slow, steady build. The weight of their choices, their dreams, often settled on my shoulders, unseen, unacknowledged. I still remember the bitter, stale taste of gas station coffee on my tongue, the only thing keeping me awake during those all-night drives in college, not to cram for my finals, but to finish freelance drafting work. The money wasn't for textbooks or ramen. It was wired straight to Mom and Dad after Dad's latest sure-thing investment had cratered, leaving them staring down the barrel of another mortgage payment they couldn't meet. Or the time I was packing for my first real vacation, a backpacking trip through the Sierras I'd saved up for over a year. The call came from Mom, her voice a carefully constructed blend of panic and disappointment. Leo, my younger brother, the family's proclaimed boy genius, needed bail money. "Just a youthful indiscretion, Ethan," Mom had said, her tone dismissing the charge of reckless driving and property damage as mere high spirits. My hiking boots went back into the closet, the scent of pine and adventure fading with them. That was the rhythm of our lives. Leo stumbled, I caught him, and Mom and Dad smoothed over the narrative. But amidst that quiet life of shouldering responsibilities, I nurtured a dream, a tangible piece of solace I was building with my own two hands. Whispering Pines Cottage. It wasn't just a structure of wood and stone. It was 12 years of my life, my savings, my sweat, crystallizing into a sanctuary on the shores of Miller Lake. I found it by accident, a dilapidated, forgotten shell half swallowed by overgrown ivy, its windows like vacant eyes staring out at the water. It smelled of decay and forgotten lives, the dampness of a place that had surrendered to the elements. But I saw the strong bones beneath, the sturdy joists, the fieldstone chimney that still stood proud. The real estate agent had looked at me like I was crazy. "It's a tear-down, son," he'd said, shaking his head. But I didn't want to tear it down. I wanted to breathe life back into it. And so began the weekends lost to labor, the weekdays spent poring over blueprints I'd drawn myself. Every swing of the hammer, every carefully sanded board, was a meditation. I learned to wrestle with stubborn plumbing, to coax electricity through old conduits, to perfectly miter crown molding until my fingers were raw and my back screamed in protest. The scent of aged cedar mixed with fresh paint became my perfume. The warmth of the sun on the newly installed deck, where I'd already pictured myself as an old man, watching non-existent grandkids learn to skip stones across the water, that was my reward. Whispering Pines wasn't just a house. It was my heart, made tangible. My plan was to turn it into a small eco-retreat, a place where others could find the same peace I found in its quiet embrace. My family, however, viewed it with a mixture of confusion and mild disdain. My mother, Eleanor, a woman whose charm was as polished as her silver, couldn't fathom why I'd pour my money and energy into that old shack, as she called it. Her love, I'd slowly come to realize, was conditional, tethered to appearances, to how well we reflected her vision of a successful family. "It's for the good of the family, Ethan. You'll understand one day," was her go-to phrase whenever her decisions felt more like decrees. It was a silken glove over an iron fist. My father, Richard, was a softer, more pliable man. He'd once had ambitions, but a string of financial missteps had left him perpetually anxious, clinging to the hope that Leo would be the one to restore the family's fortunes, and perhaps his own bruised ego. He enabled Eleanor, rarely challenging her, his silence a form of consent. And then there was Leo, my brother, 5 years my junior but light years ahead in terms of parental adoration. He was the golden child, effortlessly charismatic, blessed with an uncanny ability to convince my parents that his next harebrained scheme was the one that would finally launch them all into the stratosphere. He was, to put it mildly, allergic to hard work, preferring to live in the echo chamber of his own imagined brilliance. He'd once visited the cottage mid-renovation and surveyed my dust-covered efforts with a smirk. "Still playing with your little dirt project, Ethan?" he'd asked, before launching into a monologue about a revolutionary new app he was conceptualizing. The first real tremor, the one that should have shaken me to my core, came a few months before everything unraveled. Leo, naturally, had another unmissable venture, some cryptocurrency-based social media platform that was, in his words, going to redefine global communication. He needed a substantial investment, and quickly. My parents, predictably, turned to me. There was a family dinner, the scent of Mom's rosemary chicken unusually cloying. The conversation steered with practiced ease towards Leo's genius and his urgent need for capital. I remember the pressure, thick and suffocating. The way Leo's eyes narrowed into calculating slits when I explained I couldn't just liquidate my retirement savings. Mom had sighed, that theatrical, long-suffering sound she'd perfected. "Oh, Ethan, always so cautious. Sometimes you have to risk big to win big." I'd relented partially, giving them a sum that was significant to me but far less than they'd hoped for. The tension in the room didn't dissipate. It congealed, cold and hard. That should have been my final warning, the blaring siren I chose to ignore. A month later, an opportunity arose at my firm, a 3-month assignment overseas, managing a prestigious project in Singapore. It was a career-defining moment, one I couldn't turn down. I made arrangements, packed my bags. I left a spare set of keys to my main apartment, not the cottage, which was secured separately, or so I believed, with my parents. For watering the plants, they'd said. For checking the mail. A routine act of trust, the kind of thing families do. Or at least, the kind of thing I thought families did. The irony, looking back, is a bitter pill. I was building foundations across the world, while the one I stood on at home was about to be dynamited. The first few weeks in Singapore were a whirlwind. The work was demanding, the hours long, but I thrived on the challenge. The humidity was a shock, a thick, wet blanket that clung to you the moment you stepped outside, so different from the crisp air I associated with whispering pines. Yet, there was an energy to the city, a thrum of innovation that resonated with my architect's soul. For a little while, I almost forgot the gnawing unease that had settled in my gut before I left, that faint, lingering bitterness from the last family dinner. Then, the whispers started, not in my mind, but on the crackling line of an international call. Mrs. Henderson, my 60-something neighbor at Miller Lake, a kind woman who kept an eye on the cottage when I wasn't around, left me a truncated voicemail. Her voice was thin, worried. "Ethan, dear, it's Martha Henderson. Thought you should know. There've been some folks, looking mighty permanent over at your place. Lights on at all hours, cars I don't recognize." The call cut off abruptly, lost to the vast distance between us. My blood chilled despite the tropical heat that pressed in from my apartment window. Permanent. What did she mean? I tried calling back immediately, then again an hour later. Each time, the call went straight to her answering machine. Her cheerful, recorded voice a stark contrast to the anxiety now clawing at my insides. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe I'd forgotten to tell her about a maintenance crew I'd scheduled. But I hadn't scheduled anyone. Maybe it was a misunderstanding, a trick of the light across the lake. But Martha wasn't prone to flights of fancy. The unease solidified into a cold dread that sat heavy in my stomach, making the local laksa I'd had for dinner churn unpleasantly. A few days later, the digital dagger struck. I was logged into my U.S. bank account online, intending to transfer some funds, when my eyes snagged on a recent transaction. A massive, unexpected deposit. $450,000. My breath hitched. The memo line was stark. Clinical. Proceeds, 24 Lakeview Drive. Below it, another notification I'd overlooked. An email from a realty group I'd never heard of, Apex Property Solutions. The subject line seared itself into my brain. Congratulations, Mr. Ethan Hayes, on the successful closing of your property. My fingers trembled so violently I fumbled my phone, sending it clattering to the polished teak floor. The screen, when I picked it up, was a spiderweb of fractures. A sickeningly accurate mirror of the way my world had just splintered. Sharp edges of shattered glass dug into my palm. The physical pain a distant, insignificant echo to the silent, screaming explosion in my chest. Attached to the email were documents. A sales agreement, closing statements, and a power of attorney, all bearing what looked chillingly like my signature. I didn't wait. My hands were shaking too badly to type, so I used voice commands to initiate a video call to my parents. The connection flickered, then stabilized, revealing them in their familiar living room. Mom was arranging flowers in a vase. Dad was pretending to read the newspaper, and Leo was hovering in the background. A smug shadow, his eyes darting towards the screen with an unnerving blend of anticipation and arrogance. "Explain this," I managed, my voice raspy, holding my damaged phone up to the camera, the email displayed on its cracked screen. "Now." Mom, Eleanor, looked up, her expression one of perfectly feigned surprise. "Ethan, darling, what on earth is wrong? You look dreadful." Dad mumbled something about the poor connection. Leo just smirked. "The cottage," I said, my voice gaining a dangerous edge. "Apex Property Solutions. $450,000. What have you done?" The charade crumbled. Eleanor set down her flowers, her face hardening into the familiar lines of maternal authority. "All right, Ethan. Yes, we sold it. Just like that. No apology, no hesitation. The casual brutality of it stole the air from my lungs. You've always wasted money on meaningless things, dabbling with that rundown cabin. It was a money pit. We need that money. The family needs that money to secure your brother's future. Leo's new app is going to be huge, Ethan. This is his moment." The faces on the screen blurred. Was this what family meant to them? A resource to be plundered? My 12 years of dreams, my sweat, my sanctuary, a meaningless thing? A rundown cabin? I thought of the sunrises I'd watched from its porch, the call of the loons across the water, the feel of the worn wooden floors beneath my bare feet. Each memory was a fresh stab of pain. "Meaningless," I whispered, my voice breaking on the word. "That cabin was 12 years of my life, Mom. My future." Dad finally spoke, his voice weak, reedy. "It was for the best, son. We needed to act fast. Leo got an offer from an investor, a big one, but it required matching funds. This was the only way." Leo, emboldened, stepped fully into frame, his smirk widening. "Lighten up, Ethan. Seriously, it's just a pile of old wood. Once my app hits, I'll buy you 10 crappy cottages if you want. You'll be thanking us, you wait and see." The connection remained open, but I was no longer there. I was adrift, lost in a maelstrom of betrayal. It wasn't just the house, the money. It was the casual cruelty, the utter, contemptuous dismissal of me, my dreams, my work, by the very people who were supposed to cherish me, to protect me. This was their definition of love. This was my worth in their eyes. A means to an end. Leo's end. The call ended. I don't remember who disconnected. I sat there in the suffocating Singaporean heat, the shattered phone still in my hand, until the first light of dawn crept through the blinds, gray and unforgiving. And in that cold, bleak light, something shifted within me. The agony didn't lessen, but it began to crystallize. This wasn't an impulsive act of desperation on their part. This was calculated. This was theft, cloaked in the guise of familial concern. A memory surfaced, sharp and clear. Months before my trip, After the tense dinner where they'd pressured me for Leo's app money, I'd felt a profound shift in their demeanor. It was the deadness in their eyes when I'd passionately explained why Whispering Pines meant so much to me. They weren't listening. They were calculating, their gazes sliding past me as if I were a window display. "Chloe," I'd said to my old college friend, now a sharp-witted corporate lawyer, during a worried phone call, "I feel like they see me as a walking ATM and Whispering Pines is my main vault. It's like they feel entitled to it." Chloe, ever pragmatic, hadn't minced words. "Then insulate it, Ethan. Create a legal firewall. If you're serious about this retreat idea, treat it like a business, not a hobby." Together, over a series of discreet meetings and emails, we had formed Whispering Pines Sanctuary LLC. The cottage, its deed, its very legal existence, was formally transferred from Ethan Hayes, private citizen, to this newly minted limited liability company. I was the sole managing director, but the public-facing ownership details were deliberately obscured, shielded by layers of corporate formality. I'd even set up a separate mailing address and bank account for the LLC. The paperwork had felt like an act of profound pessimism at the time, a sign of almost paranoid distrust. Who needs an LLC for a vacation home? I thought, a little embarrassed by the precaution. Now that paranoia, that quietly laid trap, felt like the only lifeline I had left in a sea of betrayal. They thought they'd sold Ethan Hayes' cabin. They had no idea they'd just tried to defraud a corporation. And that corporation was me. The flight back to the States was a blur of recycled air and simmering rage. Each hour crawled by, fueled by lukewarm coffee and the meticulous mental rehearsal of the storm I was about to unleash. The pain of their betrayal hadn't dulled. It had been honed into a razor's edge of resolve. The moment I landed, my first call was to Chloe. We met at her downtown office. The impersonal gray and steel a stark contrast to the warm wood and sunlit spaces I'd dreamed of for Whispering Pines. Chloe, calm and methodical, listened as I recounted the video call, her expression hardening with each detail. She'd already received copies of the fraudulent sales documents from the realty group after I'd forwarded them from Singapore. "They're brazen. I'll give them that," she said, tapping a perfectly manicured nail on the forged power of attorney. "But also incredibly stupid." She confirmed that she had, as per our contingency plan, already put the unwitting buyers, a Mr. and Mrs. Henderson, and their realtor on preliminary notice from Whispering Pines Sanctuary LLC. The notice was carefully worded, speaking of a significant title dispute and an unauthorized transfer attempt regarding the property at 24 Lakeview Drive. It would have caused immediate confusion, halting any further transactions and, more importantly, preventing my parents from accessing the full sum if they hadn't already. Armed with a plan, I drove to my parents' house. The familiar street, the manicured lawn, even the slightly crooked mailbox I'd straightened a dozen times, all felt alien. The air in their living room was thick with a strange mixture of false bonhomie and the metallic tang of my unspoken fury. They'd redecorated. New, plush sofas, a ridiculously oversized flat-screen television. A little advance on Leo's success. Mom trilled, her eyes bright with a manic energy, daring me to object. Leo was lounging on one of the new sofas, phone pressed to his ear, pacing as he spouted jargon about synergy, user acquisition, and burn rates. He spared me a dismissive nod. My father, Richard, just looked shifty, avoiding my gaze, muttering about how good it was to have me home. The charade was almost suffocating. The next day, Chloe sent the official summons. Not to my parents' home, but to them individually, requesting their presence along with Leo's at her office. The letterhead was stark. Law Offices of Chloe Davis and Associates. The subject, urgent legal matter regarding property at 24 Lakeview Drive and an asset of Whispering Pines Sanctuary LLC. That carefully chosen legal entity, that name they wouldn't recognize, was the first shot across the bow. They arrived at Chloe's office looking flustered, their initial bravado already showing cracks. Eleanor tried to take charge immediately, her voice a little too loud in the quiet, imposing conference room. "Ethan, this is utterly ridiculous. Call off your little lawyer friend. We can discuss this as a family. The antique mahogany table between us felt miles wide. Chloe, the epitome of professional composure, gestured for them to sit. She didn't waste time on pleasantries. Mr. and Mrs. Hayes, Mr. Leo Hayes, she began, her voice calm but firm. We've asked you here to discuss the unauthorized and fraudulent attempted transfer of an asset belonging to my client, Whispering Pines Sanctuary LLC. She slid a bound set of documents across the polished table. Specifically, the property commonly known as Whispering Pines Cottage, located at 24 Lakeview Drive. My father's face went pale. I don't understand. Ethan owned the house. We had power of attorney. He fumbled for the document they'd used. Leo scoffed, attempting his usual swagger. Yeah, it's just some paperwork trick. He's just being dramatic. On the contrary, Chloe continued, her gaze unwavering. She gestured to the documents she'd provided them. These are the formation papers for Whispering Pines Sanctuary LLC, legally filed with the Secretary of State nearly 6 months ago. And this, she tapped another paper, is the official, recorded deed transferring full ownership of the property at 24 Lakeview Drive from Mr. Ethan Hayes to Whispering Pines Sanctuary LLC, dated 5 months ago, well before the power of attorney you claim to possess was purportedly signed, and certainly before this fraudulent sale. She let that sink in. The property you attempted to sell, Mrs. Hayes, was not, in fact, Mr. Ethan Hayes's personal asset to be disposed of at the time of your transaction. It is, and was at all relevant times, solely owned by a legally distinct corporate entity. The color drained from Eleanor's face. The carefully constructed mask of maternal concern was slipping, revealing something harder, uglier beneath. But he's the owner of this LLC, isn't he? It's the same thing. I spoke then, my voice surprisingly steady, devoid of the tremor that had plagued me for weeks. It's not the same thing, Mother. And more importantly, the power of attorney you used, that fraudulent piece of paper. I never signed it. Chloe nodded gravely. Which brings us to the more serious matter of forgery. She produced another set of documents. My sworn affidavit stating I was out of the country on the date the POA was supposedly signed and notarized, and a preliminary forensic handwriting analysis report I'd commissioned from Singapore, comparing the signature on the POA to my known verified signatures. The report was damning, highlighting numerous discrepancies indicative of a crude forgery. But the real bombshell was yet to come. Chloe dimmed the conference room lights slightly and turned on a large monitor on the wall. Before Mr. Hayes left for his overseas assignment, she said, her voice dropping into a register that commanded absolute attention, he had a new, comprehensive security system installed in his home office. This included a small, motion-activated camera covering his desk, where he occasionally keeps sensitive documents. She clicked a mouse. The screen flickered to life. The footage was clear, date and time stamped. My home office, my desk, and then my parents. Eleanor, her face tight with concentration, was nervously sifting through papers on my desk. Richard stood beside her, looking over her shoulder, equally tense. He found an old, signed tax document of mine. Eleanor took it, smoothed it out, then picked up a blank POA form, clearly a generic template downloaded from the internet. Painstakingly, almost childishly, she began to practice my signature on a scratch pad, glancing back and forth between my real signature and her clumsy attempts. Richard muttered encouragement. Then, Leo appeared in the doorway, his voice, captured clearly by the microphone, sharp and impatient. Are you done yet? Just get it done. The investor is waiting for confirmation. The final, sickening shot was Richard retrieving an old, dusty notary stamp from a briefcase, presumably from one of his long-defunct business ventures. And, after a moment of hesitation, one of them, it was hard to tell who in the slightly blurry motion, stamping the forged document. A choked gasp escaped my mother. My father looked like he might actually faint, his hand clutching his chest. Leo, for once in his life, was utterly speechless. His jaw slack, his eyes wide with dawning terror. The smugness, the arrogance, all of it had vanished, replaced by the stark, ugly face of guilt. That's not, you can't. Eleanor whispered, her voice breaking, not with sorrow, but with the terror of exposure. Oh, I can, mother, I said, the words like ice shards. And I have forgery, real estate fraud, conspiracy to commit fraud, using a defunct notary seal for fraudulent notarization. The district attorney might find that footage particularly illuminating. I leaned forward, my gaze locking with hers. You see, you didn't just try to sell my house. You tried to sell me out for him. I flicked my eyes towards Leo, who flinched as if struck. Eleanor finally found her voice, though it was a shrill, desperate cry. You do this to your own mother? To your own family? After everything we've done for you? I stood up then, the movement slow, deliberate. All the years of suppressed anger, of quiet hurt, of shouldering their burdens, coalesced into a single point of cold, hard clarity. Everything you've done for me? I repeated, my voice low but carrying the weight of a lifetime. Or everything I've done for this family, only to be dismissed, to have my dreams, my work, my very essence, casually discarded as meaningless things? You didn't just forge my signature on a piece of paper, mother. You tried to forge my life, to bend it to your will, to Leo's benefit. This LLC, this evidence. I gestured to the screen, to the damning footage. This is me taking my life back. The $450,000 you received from Mr. and Mrs. Henderson? That's now evidence in a major fraud case. My company, Whispering Pines Sanctuary LLC, will be expecting full restitution for damages and legal costs. And I imagine the Hendersons will be expecting their money back from you. Chloe added, her voice like a final gavel strike. Mr. and Mrs. Henderson have already been made fully aware of the fraudulent nature of this transaction by our firm. Their legal counsel is, as we speak, drafting a civil suit for recovery of funds and substantial damages. And they are, understandably, considering their options regarding criminal complaints. The silence that followed was broken only by my father's ragged breathing. The tables hadn't just turned. They'd been obliterated. The immediate aftermath in Chloe's conference room was pure chaos, a stark contrast to the calculated calm of our presentation. Eleanor, her face a mask of disbelief and fury, lunged from outrage to desperate, tearful pleas within the span of minutes. Ethan, you can't do this. We'll be ruined. Think of your father's health. Think of the scandal. Her voice, usually so controlled, cracked with a raw panic I'd never heard before. Richard, slumped in his chair, looked like a broken man, his face ashen, his eyes darting between me and Chloe as if searching for an escape hatch that didn't exist. Leo, true to form, was the first to lash out, his terror manifesting as aggression. You set us up, he spat, his voice trembling. You were always jealous of my potential. You wanted to see me fail. I met his gaze, my own surprisingly steady. The old sting of his accusations, the familiar barb of his envy, no longer found purchase. You set yourselves up, Leo, I said, my voice quiet but firm. Your greed, your entitlement, Mom and Dad's willingness to sacrifice anyone and anything for your potential. I just built a firewall you were all too arrogant, too self-absorbed, to even notice. Chloe stepped in then, her professionalism a necessary anchor in the emotional storm. She calmly outlined the immediate legal realities. The civil suit from the Hendersons was now a certainty. The funds they'd received were proceeds of fraud and would be pursued vigorously. Criminal charges for forgery, wire fraud, and mail fraud were highly probable, especially given the irrefutable video evidence. They needed to retain competent legal counsel immediately. There would be no making this go away. The days that followed were a blur of legal correspondence and stony silence from my parents' side. The Hendersons, a retired couple who had sunk their life savings into what they believed was their dream lakeside home, were understandably devastated and furious. Their lawyers moved swiftly. My parents, I learned through the legal grapevine, had managed to spend a significant portion of the initial deposit, mostly on Leo's business, which, of course, had no actual product or viable plan. This only deepened their financial and legal quagmire. The carefully curated image my parents had cultivated in their community began to crumble. News, even when carefully managed by Chloe to primarily protect my interests while still exposing the truth, has a way of seeping out. Whispers turned into gasps of disbelief among their social circle, their church group, the extended family. The shame, I imagine, was a heavy burden for Eleanor, a woman who valued appearances above almost all else. They tried, of course. Desperate voicemails, tearful text messages filled with guilt trips and accusations. "How can you be so heartless, Ethan?" Mom had wailed in one message. "We are your family. We will lose everything." My father sent a rambling email, pleading for forgiveness, for a loan, for me to somehow intervene and stop the legal avalanche. Each message was a fresh attempt to pull me back into their dysfunctional orbit, to make me responsible for the consequences of their actions. My chest ached with a phantom limb of familial duty, that deeply ingrained instinct to fix their messes, to absorb their pain, the way I always had. For a fleeting moment, I wavered, the image of my father's broken face, my mother's unraveling composure, tugging at something old and vulnerable within me. But then I looked at the serene watercolor painting of whispering pines that Chloe had gifted me, now hanging in my apartment, and I remembered the cold calculation in their eyes on that video call. I remembered Leo's sneer. "No," I whispered to the empty room. "Not this time. This time, the pain, the consequences were theirs to own." I instructed Chloe to handle all communications. I changed my number. It was a painful, brutal severing, like amputating a gangrenous limb to save the whole. During this tumultuous period, a lifeline emerged from an unexpected quarter. My Aunt Carol, my mother's younger sister, a pragmatic, no-nonsense woman who had always kept a slight distance from Eleanor's dramas, reached out. She'd heard the increasingly wild rumors and called me directly. I told her everything, the unvarnished truth. She listened patiently, without interruption. When I finished, there was a long pause. "Ethan," she finally said, her voice filled with a quiet sorrow. "Your mother. She always had a blind spot where Leo was concerned, and she always saw you as the capable one, the one who would just absorb it all. I'm just so terribly sorry it took something this devastating for you to finally draw the line." Her validation, her quiet understanding, was a balm to a wound I hadn't realized was so deep. It was the beginning of a new kind of family connection, one built on honesty, not obligation. Eventually, the legal dust began to settle. Whispering Pines Sanctuary LLC, my company, formally and indisputably reasserted its ownership of the cottage. The Hendersons, with Chloe's assistance in untangling the mess, eventually got a judgment against my parents for the full amount they had paid, plus damages and legal fees. My parents were forced to sell their own home, the one I'd grown up in, the one filled with so many complicated memories, to satisfy the debt. They moved into a small, rented apartment. Leo's genius app, starved of its illicit funding, vanished like morning mist. He was forced to get a mundane 9-to-5 job, the kind he'd always sneered at, his bitterness a palpable cloud around him. Criminal charges were eventually filed, but given their age and Richard's declining health, my parents pleaded guilty to lesser offenses, receiving hefty fines, probation, and mandatory counseling. There was no jail time, but their lives, as they knew them, were irrevocably altered. My first visit back to Whispering Pines after everything was heavy. The scent of pine and damp earth was still there. The call of the loons still echoed across the lake. But the air inside the cottage felt stale, tainted by the phantom scent of their betrayal. I threw open every window, letting the crisp lake breeze sweep through, carrying out more than just dust. I walked the property, my hand trailing along the warm, sun-drenched wood of the deck I had built, board by board. It was no longer just a dream. It was a monument to my resilience, to my reclaimed self. The plans for the eco-retreat were back on, but now with a deeper, more profound sense of purpose. It would be a sanctuary, yes, but also a testament to the strength found in choosing oneself. The scars remain, of course. Betrayal by your own blood leaves a mark that fades but never quite vanishes. It's a dull ache on rainy days, a shadow that flickers at the edge of memory during family holidays I no longer attend in the same way. But I'm building something new, not just with wood and stone at Whistling Pines, but within myself. I learned that no is a complete sentence, and that boundaries, firm and lovingly enforced, are the truest expression of self-respect. My old blind spot, that desperate, childlike yearning for their approval, their acceptance. It's still there, a faint, almost invisible scar, but it no longer dictates my path. I find my approval from within now, from the quiet satisfaction of work well done, from the genuine connections I forge with people like Chloe, like Aunt Carol, people who see me, value me, for who I truly am. Betrayal by family cuts to the very bone, but I've learned it can also carve out a space within you, a hollowed-out place where a stronger, more authentic self can finally take root and emerge. The cost of that excavation is undeniably high, but the freedom you find on the other side, the clear, unobstructed view of your own path forward, that, I've discovered, is absolutely priceless. Have you ever been forced to choose between your family and your own survival or sanity? How did you find the strength to draw your line in the sand, and what did you build on the other side of it? I'd be interested to hear your stories in the comments below.
你们知道为什么我最近没有开播吗？因为我还没有学到新歌，所以我不敢开播。可是我最近有学了一首非常流行的，你们知道是什么歌的了哈？2个字。我可以先清唱几句吗？可以哦。哦，这是我刚刚去拍了造型的。